Throughout the history of global narrative art, there have been innovators, some of whom changed things more than others. For example, in the 1900s alone, there were writers like Dashiell Hammett, who altered the DNA of crime and mystery fiction by infusing his work with the very real experience he got working for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. He also treated women terribly, which I'm sure also influenced the genre. Then there were writers like James Joyce, who made the complexity of his novels so dense that people spend years reading single books of his. Joyce's innovations in literary fiction were so wild that imitating him would basically be impossible. Not that I've ever finished a book of his. And then there was the Beat generation, which challenged the limits of what could be talked about in narrative art with works like Howl and Naked Lunch, and introduced a hybrid style of poetry based on translations of Chinese poetry, although that's another story. The 1900s had many more other innovative writers. But in the bigger picture, you get things that completely alter the course of fiction, such as the influence of the publishing industry. Then there are alternate traditions like those of African griots, unique narrative techniques like those of Japanese origin, and the genre mashup that is modern Bollywood. I don't pretend to understand everything I just talked about, but I bring all that up to put Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in perspective. In one sense, it was an improvised spooky story that the creator then wrote down. In another sense, it basically opened the floodgates for much of modern writing. Everyone from Stephen King to Spider-Man has a great debt to Shelley and Frankenstein, either directly or because the novel heavily influenced the gothic horror boom that followed, which brought us vampires and other classic monsters. Now, I don't personally buy the idea that science fiction began with Frankenstein. There are stories from ancient Japan, for example, that qualify as proto-sci-fi, sending their characters to alternate dimensions. Horror also has its roots elsewhere, just ask folklore traditions worldwide. In addition, the stories of the Golem from Judaism and the tales of the Greek mythological figure of Prometheus have ideas very similar to Frankenstein, but predate the scientist and his monster by over a millennium. But it's hard to argue that Mary Shelley's book didn't create modern genre fiction. The novel itself has some tropes of the era in which it was written, the early 1800s, namely 1818. Frankenstein is written partly in letters and makes some interesting narrative choices. For example, in the book, Victor Frankenstein creates the monster, then goes into depression and basically forgets about his creation for a while. But the innovation, at least in Western literary tradition and now global literary tradition, is just off the charts. And the basic concept stands up today. Let's say that Shelley hadn't published Frankenstein until the modern day. She might not get over the hurdles of getting fiction in front of readers in the 2020s, but the idea is still rock solid. I would say spoiler alert, but you know the plot. A scientist driven by intelligence, obsession, and single-mindedness brings a being made of pieces of different corpses to life. The creature escapes, then starts killing the scientist's friends. That's still badass by today's standards. But you have to imagine a world where Shakespeare was still extremely influential in popular fiction, and Jane Austen was a literary superstar. I mean, the historical novel was being invented around Shelley's time. I'm no Victorian or Gothic fiction historian, but I'm pretty sure the literary environment was one where Frankenstein straight up melted minds. Obviously, the book is still being adapted today. As of my writing this, the latest take was a more or less faithful adaptation by Guillermo del Toro. Later this year, we'll get a remake of sorts of The Bride of Frankenstein, which is a derivative work from the 1930s. This remake will be directed by Maggie Gyllenhaal. I don't have time to list all the other versions of the tale here. Wikipedia counts over 1,000 takes of the story and its related concepts. But Frankenstein's biggest influence isn't the story's constant rehashing. Its greatest accomplishment isn't even related to the wave of Gothic horror that followed it decades later. Although important works like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula, and The King in Yellow, the last of which heavily influenced H.P. Lovecraft, those probably wouldn't have existed without Mary Shelley. I would say that what Frankenstein really contributed to the world was that it integrated fiction and technology. When someone says there's nothing new under the sun and that every story's already been told, my response is to talk about Shakespeare's cyberpunk sonnets, because technology has changed everything about fiction. Romeo and Juliet could have just texted each other. Fictional murderers that operated easily in the past have forensic evidence and surveillance to reckon with today. Even the concept of photo ID cards ruins a ridiculous amount of old plots. But as technology has evolved, so has fiction. See the modern era's genetically modified stories like The Substance, Gattaca, and the upcoming The Beauty, or the proto-internet imagined in 80s, 90s, and 2000s works like Neuromancer, Ghost in the Shell, and The Matrix. Before that, you had the birth of space travel, which brought us alien worlds. Before that, there was industrialization, which brought us robots. Before that, you had the intersection of quack science, European conquest, and real technological advancement you find in Frankenstein. It's odd today to read a character talk about discovering the North Pole, but that's a big part of Frankenstein's plot. Scientific concepts that have long been disproven but were common in Mary Shelley's day are all over the book. Now, one thing today's audiences might not get is that the concept of someone trying to make a new human out of pieces of other corpses wasn't that unrealistic in her time. Not that it would have worked, but the idea of a scientist undertaking such an experiment, someone probably did. So Frankenstein did a lot of things. It basically repackaged the concept of horror for the modern Western world. It ushered in a literary era that gave us creatures we see used by writers all the time today. The story is retold every 5 minutes, and it fused fiction, or at least genre fiction, to technological progress. All of this is pretty astounding for a spooky story made up by a 17-year-old as part of a storytelling exercise. And the fact that Mary Shelley was a woman way before women in the West got the right to vote or could determine their lives for themselves at all, that can't be overlooked. The odds were stacked against her success, and Mary Shelley's talent as a writer shone through. Frankenstein is a landmark book and really changed the world in some wild ways. And it wasn't even Mary Shelley's only important genre work, although her dystopian apocalyptic book, The Last Man, isn't as well known or studied, and I haven't read it. A truly innovative writer and a truly classic work, Mary Shelley and Frankenstein belong high up in the pantheon of modern fiction, if not at the top. What about you? Have you read Frankenstein? Did you watch the Del Toro adaptation? I'm thinking of doing a series on this channel exploring various gothic horror works. Would you watch that? As always, you can find news about me, Matchstick, my own books, and also get updates via the link in the description. Peace out.